Hi, I'm Heidi Schwartz. I've lived in Needham for about 11 years. I first became interested in the issue of affordable housing when I went to a talk by the author Richard Rothstein, who spoke about his book, The Color of Law. At that talk, I learned about the history in our country of how the government used zoning and lending practices to lead to racial segregation in American cities. And I was really surprised to learn about that because it wasn't something I had learned it through going to school. And I decided that I wanted to get more involved working toward these issues within my community. And Equal Justice Needham has given me the opportunity to do that. I'm part of the Housing Working Group, and together we have a legislative agenda that includes 4 bills. Together, these bills would raise money for affordable housing and also provide protection for renters who may be facing eviction. In today's show, we'll take a look at the history of housing discrimination in Needham.
Hello, and welcome to Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice in Needham. I am the show host, Gretchen Cook Anderson. Today, we'll learn how Needham developed the way that it did, with very little economic and racial diversity compared to Boston, Framingham, Waltham, Milton, and other neighboring towns. Currently, only about 3% of Needham's residents are Black or otherwise African American, compared to 7.63% in the state as a whole. Multiple factors have contributed to Needham's low numbers of Black residents. Restrictive covenants, legally allowed discrimination, unequal lending practices such as redlining, and zoning restrictions have all contributed. Today, 92% of Needham's residential land is zoned for single-family homes, which limits housing choices, even though overt discrimination is now illegal. Today's panelists will help clarify these issues. We have with us Needham Planning Board member Jeanne McKnight, Paula Dickerman, a housing advocate, and Rachel Green, also a housing advocate and researcher. Let's start with Rachel. Rachel, I know that, because Rachel has spent many hours looking into local documents for insight into historical discriminatory practices in Needham. So Rachel, I understand that federal, state, and local laws in the United States promoted racial housing discrimination in the first half of the 20th century. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And what was going on in Needham when what was previously a farming community began developing as a residential suburb of Boston? So let's start there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So de jure segregation, as in government promoted segregation, has been happening in this country since it was founded. According to a 2010 census report, Boston is 67.8% segregated, and the Black population in Boston is now 25.2% compared to just 2.9% in Needham, as you said. The line between Boston and Needham is very divided and segregated, and that could not have happened by accident. Jeanne will talk later about the first zoning bylaws, but before zoning was established, there were private developers who owned tracts of land and could parcel them out with restricted covenants. Now, this could be seen as an argument for de facto segregation, as in private individual practice causing segregation and discrimination, but the fact that the state courts actually enforce these covenants proves otherwise. Only in 1948 did the Supreme Court rule in Shelley v. Kramer that the government could not enforce these private restrictions, but those covenants were still there. Without state enforcement, people found ways around that ruling by suing homeowners who sold their homes to Black people in violation of a restricted covenant. They claimed that the value of their own property would decrease by Black people moving in. So finally, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act declared restrictive covenants unconstitutional, but there have been other challenges since then in achieving more equitable housing. So moving on to Needham. Needham was founded in 1711, and refusal to rent or sell to Black people only became illegal in 1948 when the Massachusetts anti-discrimination law was passed, which shows that discrimination was happening until that time. In Massachusetts, the Black population has always been low, about 1% until 1950, and that population has always been concentrated to the Boston, Cambridge area. When Needham was going through industrial expansion in the beginning of the 20th century, European immigrants were able to come here and seek opportunities in factories, but there was discrimination against Black people to also be able to do that. Also of note is the period after World War II, from 1940 to 1960, when Needham's housing stock increased by 44%. White homebuyers were given FHA loans to buy those homes and accumulate wealth, whereas Black homebuyers were denied FHA insured loans because of redlining, and Black veterans were actually denied VA guarantee loans. So they were less likely to be able to buy those homes in Needham during that critical period of expansion. So that sets up some of the history of redlining. Now to move on to restrictive covenants. For the next part of this research, I want to acknowledge Gloria Grice, who's a local historian who provided these real estate ads, which were vital in directing our research. So going back to around the year 1900, this area of land along Great Plain Ave that's shown, it was owned by separate local developers, and they really had the power to establish Needham as a desirable, restricted place to live with quote unquote good neighbors, as shown in advertising for this real estate. So this ad for a plot of land owned by Levi Ladd states, there are proper restrictions on this property for the protection of the neighbor and the home. Now this means financial restrictions, but that comes with deeper implications. So here's the plan from 1893 of that land with the specific restrictions in the bottom right corner. Also in a deed from Ladd, which is more clear to read, that no building shall be erected for a dwelling house that shall cost less than $3,500 in Great Plain Ave, at less than $4,000 on lots corner of Great Plain Avenue and other streets. I don't have the exact inflation rate from 1893 to today of those prices, but we can assume that $4,000 in 1893 is a lot of money, and it shows just how affluent someone had to be at that time to build or buy a home there. So the restrictions in this plan, technically, they expire in 1910, but they lay the groundwork for homes which have only become more expensive over time. The lot sizes shown on this plan appear to be approximately 10,000 square feet, and they have stayed that size until today, considering how property values have skyrocketed over time. Establishing this size lot created more of a monopoly on real estate. These price minimums and large lots really translate to socioeconomic and ultimately racial restrictions because of wealth disparities that exist between races, which Paula will talk more about. So these price restrictions are code for racial discrimination if you read between the lines. Here's another example of an ad for the restricted community, Carlita Park, and it also mentions restrictions. It says, now is your opportunity to own a home or purchase a lot and build an attractive home in one of the most beautiful and restricted locations around Boston. And here is the plan for the land of Carlita Park, which was owned by W.G. Blade. Deeds from these plots of land reference restrictions, and again, by virtue of being big lots in an already white area, they were designed to keep Black people out. And lastly, the most compelling and definitive example of a racial restriction is this deed that actually Peter Olive, who's a member of EJN, he found this deed through the Norfolk Registry of Deeds. So at the bottom of the page, it says, the premises shall not be sold or leased to or occupied by anyone of the Black or Negro race. Here's the land plan that is the deed that is part of this land, which is on Great Plain Ave near Olin College. And this land was owned by McIntosh, who owned lots of property at the time. Other properties on this plan reference restrictions in their deeds, like on this deed from 1936, which presumably mean the same racial restrictions from the initial deed that I showed. So to conclude, when I started doing this research, I expected to find other examples like this last one I showed, But what I actually discovered was a more covert process of sanctioning the suburbs as exclusive places through various policies. Looking at all this evidence of inequity really proves that change is overdue. I hope to continue learning about how this happened in Needham and on a larger scale, and to continue to advocate for ways to bring more diversity and equity to Needham, my town, through more housing choice and through other creative ways. Thank you.
Wow, Rachel, my goodness. Stunning, let me tell you. Thank you so much for those. Those are some fascinating historical details, that really do underscore exactly what we're talking about, and that history that's really there, and that you've really uncovered some of that. Thank you so much. So Paula, turning to you, how did federal policies create racial wealth disparities? Can you speak to that a bit?
I can. We all know that even today, with the groundwork that Rachel was just talking about, most of the metropolitan areas in the United States are highly racially segregated. The FHA and VA loans that also Rachel mentioned, I want to talk a little bit more about that. So this was post-war, and in the country, we wanted to build up the suburbs. And one of the ways that we, when I say we, I mean the country, did that is by having Federal Housing Authority loans insured. Veterans Administration would insure, the loans made to individuals. And these were working class people who could move out to the suburbs and buy these homes. Probably the parents of many of the people watching this, myself included, bought homes at this time for a low amount of money, and those loans could be insured by the federal government. However, it is also true that those loans had explicit restrictions, and not all of them, but many of them, that one could not sell to a Black family, you could not resell to a Black family, you could not rent to a Black family. And they even would sometimes not insure a development that was near a Black town. And in fact, in Los Angeles, they actually built a wall around a development so that there would be no encroachment. And the result of this is the wealth gap that we see today. One of the important figures that one might see is that Blacks make at least 60% of what whites make in the United States in income, but have 10% of the wealth. And people like my parents were able to accrue equity that they could use to send me to college, that they could use for retirement, that they could use in sickness or to get through a tough time, to start a business. And the Black families who could have afforded these homes did not build up that equity. And so in 1968, when things opened up and it was like, oh, we're not going to discriminate anymore, you can buy these houses. With what? The equity accumulation had not happened. One other example is public housing, which didn't start in this country as a welfare program. It started as a housing program. We needed more housing, and the government stepped up and built housing. And that housing was, again, affordable to working class families, which included all races. However, those projects were segregated from the beginning on purpose by race. Also, when you segregate one community into one place where they're not able to accumulate wealth, other things happen in that community. There's more poverty in that community, and poverty breeds all kinds of other stuff. And as we know, there was disparate treatment in education as well. So those are two pretty big ones. I do want to say one other thing. I think it relates to something that Rachel said. In 2006, Justice Roberts and the Supreme Court were looking at a racial discrimination housing case actually it was an education case, but Justice Roberts was wise enough to realize that the reason we have segregated schools is that we have segregated communities because we do local funding, right? So it follows. And he concluded that the federal government, this is 2006, has no responsibility to fix segregation because he thought at that time that that was de jure segregation. That is, it just happened. People are prejudiced, people have different incomes, people like to live with their own kind. Completely ignoring the fact that there was de jure segregation by laws. This was federal, but I also want to mention that state and local police would not enforce, in fact, would sometimes ignore when there were mobs of white people railing against a Black family moving into a white community. And police would just let it happen. So there was no enforcement of laws in certain places. Obviously, this is not in the whole country and all the time. But these things lay the foundation for the segregation we see today.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And that also brings to mind, a situation that my own family experienced. Not here in Needham, thank goodness, not here, but my own family. We moved here from Maryland. So my husband and I, we bought a home in 1999, no problem, right? In an affluent community in Montgomery County, Maryland. And so we purchased a home. We have no issue there. But then in 2005, we made a decision to refinance our mortgage because we wanted to do some updates to our kitchen. We were going to refurbish the kitchen and update it. And so it was very simple in our minds. Lots of people do refinancings, right? All over the place. People in Needham, people everywhere else. It's a pretty common thing that homeowners do. So we took the steps to apply for the mortgage refinancing. Just as anyone would, but you know how there are those little demographic boxes that you can choose to check or not check on a mortgage lending application. And I, feeling kind of innocent about the whole thing and assuming that these kinds of practices no longer existed, I checked the box that related to how I self-identify as Black and or African American. And so little did I know at the time that in just checking that box that I was setting us off on a trajectory for the next 16 years that would have such a deep impact on my husband and on our household finances. So we refinanced through Countrywide Mortgage, and that was in 2005. Within a year or two, Countrywide was bought out by Bank of America. And so now our loan was part of this huge company, Bank of America. But what we realized immediately when we first got that first monthly invoice for a mortgage payment, what we realized was that the mortgage payment was significantly higher than what had been quoted to us over the phone when we initially had phone conversations with their lending representatives. I was quoted one thing. But then after we signed all the documents, and we were rushed through the closing documents, I also will mention that. I contacted the bank, I talked to them about it. I said, well, this is not the same amount of money per month that we were quoted. And we were told, but this is based on the documents you signed. There was no way for us to get out of it. We were paying an exorbitant amount more than what we were quoted. And we had no idea why. Let's fast forward into 2012. We were contacted by a law firm that mentioned that we were part of a class action lawsuit against Bank of America for discriminatory lending practices. And what essentially happened is we were quoted one particular interest rate at the outset of our application. But because the bank was able to identify us as a Black household, they did this with Black households and households that self-identified as Hispanic. It's Hispanic non-white, right? We were charged a much higher interest rate than white customers who had the same household income and the same credit scores. after about 8 years of paying the same, this very, very high mortgage, we had lost over $100,000 cumulative. The impact on my family and on our household has been long-term. So even after all of this was discovered, and even after the class action lawsuit went our direction, went our way, we never were able to recoup all of those lost funds. And so again, that's just one example from one family in the recent past. And so, I hope that might help to underscore what's gone on for many, many years, and where there were even deeper impacts over time. And so we've still been in recovery over, all that lost wealth. So let's move on to Jeanne. I would like to talk with Jeanne. Jeanne, can you help us understand some of the history of zoning in Needham and how zoning was used to regulate housing choices in the town? And what direction is the planning board going in relation to inclusionary zoning policies?
Yes, thank you. I'm Jeanne McKnight, and I've served on the Needham Planning Board for 15 years, and I have a background in urban planning and municipal law. I'm retired now. Rachel presented examples of private recorded restrictive covenants imposed on Needham property. She mentioned the 1948 case, Shelley versus Kramer, where the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional for state courts to enforce racial restrictions, and the 1948 anti-discrimination law. Until 1948, even restrictions like the ones we found on the property on Great Plain Avenue near Roland College were enforced to prevent Black people from buying homes in white areas. And we heard from Gretchen about discriminatory practices occurring within the past 10, 20 years. But let me go back in history. Early in the 20th century, some municipalities, particularly in the South, adopted ordinances to mandate separate Black and white residential areas. Such ordinances were declared invalid by the U.S. Supreme Court in its 1917 decision, Buchanan versus Warley, which invalidated a Louisville, Kentucky law mandating such apartheid. In the wake of the Buchanan decision, the enthusiasm of federal officials for economic zoning to replace expressly racial zoning grew rapidly. And in 1921, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover organized a committee on zoning that encouraged every municipality to adopt a zoning ordinance. That was when it started. Before that, there was no such thing as local zoning. And let me show you Needham's first zoning map and point out some features of the town's 1925 zoning bylaw. Like today, most of Needham was zoned single residence, shown as the unshaded area on the map. Back then, the residence area, the single residence area, was zoned for 7,000 square foot lots. Today, Needham's single residence A zone requires 1 acre lots in about half of the town. And our single residence B zone now requires 10,000 square foot lots. I learned that in 1925, all Needham's business zones allowed apartment buildings. We're going to be studying our business zones with a view to whether we should be having apartment zones allowed. They are allowed in some of our business zones today, but not all of them. And we'd like to consider whether we should be more allowing apartments in other places. And also, I learned that accessory dwelling units, as I said, could be authorized by the Board of Selectmen though this was only permitted within dwellings that existed in 1925. We have accessory dwelling unit bylaw, but it's very strict. It's only for family members. It's only for caretakers of the owners. We'll be thinking about whether we should expand the circumstances under which you can have an accessory dwelling unit, as has been done in many other communities. We'll keep researching. We'll keep learning and applying this knowledge to our current land use issues.
Thank you so much. And the mention of the Rothstein book, The Color of Law. I mean, that book, for anyone who is interested in, learning more and digging into America's history around wealth disparity and the real estate market and housing discrimination, the information that he's imparted and has unearthed in that book is absolutely astounding. So thank you very much, Jeanne. Really appreciate that. So Paula, another quick question for you before we go today. Do you think that there's an appetite these days in Needham among residents for more housing density to bring more economic and racial diversity to the town?
I definitely do think that there's that appetite among many of the residents in Needham. And as I thought about that, there are kind of three buckets of reasons. And one is the benefits of diversity in general. Eliminating or at least lessening the feeling of us versus them, which rears its head in many different ways. But having experience and access to people with different backgrounds, different cultures, different ethnicities can only be a benefit for the town, for the town's creativity, for the way the town approaches problems and solves problems, for our students to be exposed to the rest of the world. We all know the demographics in this country are changing. So in general, it's good for us as citizens. The second thing is more mercurial, and that is with more housing, and specifically more affordable housing, our seniors can stay in the town. Our children can buy into the town. Sure. I learned of something called the Segregation Tax. We pay more money for homes, and our children will pay more money for homes in this town because we're segregated, because there's this myth that somehow that's better and people will pay money for that. And the third thing is, it's kind of the right thing to do. I mean, look at what we've just heard. There's specific things that were done in Needham and surrounding towns that were discriminatory for many years. And there's federal things that were done for generations that were discriminatory. And I think many others do in Needham, that we need to do our fair share and provide more housing choice. There's a crisis. There's a lack of housing, and we need to do something to help that problem.
Thank you very much for that. So this is all the time we have today. We have lots to think about, as we consider where we are and where we want to go in terms of creating an equitable housing environment here in Needham. Thank you very much to Rachel, all that great historical information, to Paula and Jeanne. Again, you just really dug into Needham's history. And we ask that everyone please take a moment to go to the EJN website to fill out a short survey so we can learn your opinions on this particular topic. So at this point, I'd like to say that we'll see you next time. I'm Gretchen Cook Anderson, and this is Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice in Needham. Thank you so much for your time.